started. Hey, Ken, come on up. There you are. Great. Here, take a seat. So, yes, I'll introduce myself and our guests, and then I'm going to say some words of introduction, and then this is just going to be an open panel discussion on what I agree is a topic we've been hearing about repeatedly, and a very important one, incrementality. And so first, let me introduce the esteemed panelists that we have here.
Come up here, you click the check, and then they go to live.
Okay, terrific. First, on my right is Markus Dmytrzak, who is Director of Decision Sciences at Walmart's Sam's Club. Next to him is Andy Fisher, a well-known face at ICOM, who is head of M1 Advanced TV at Merkle. And then Ken Mallon, a guy I've known about as long as Andy, which is many years, who is SVP of Market Science at Samba TV. And finally, Michael Heberle, who you saw a moment ago, EVP of Performance Marketing and IPG Brands. And myself, I am Rick Bruner. I am Vice Chair for ICOM in the United States, and I am CEO of a startup called Central Control, which provides tools for advertisers and ad tech and media companies to run randomized controlled trials for advertising effect. So incrementality, I've been in this field for about 20 years, and this is my favorite buzzword ever. So I want to give a little bit of context about, what I believe we mean as we're talking about this topic. The incremental in the phrase incrementality is the incremental, in my understanding, the incremental contribution of the advertising to the conversions within the audience that you're targeting with the campaign. And what's critical there is, I think we have gotten to a point where a lot of the direction, certainly in programmatic advertising and a lot of our digital advertising, is trying to predict who is most likely to convert and then get an ad in front of them quickly before they do so and drop a cookie on them, and then when they convert, claim credit for the conversion. But the job of advertising is not to predict who's going to convert and count them. The job of advertising is to persuade people to convert. And so much of what we're investing is the people who are already going to convert. And that's the critical question, is understanding what is the actual effect that the advertising is having. And I would suggest, that my simplest definition of incrementality is an intention on the part of the marketers to understand the causal effect of the advertising. And it describes a spectrum of techniques. And we've heard, some conversations, some descriptions of techniques that pervade a lot of measurement in our space that I would describe as quasi-experiments, which falls into the spectrum of incrementality. But I would hope we can all agree here that there are a number of techniques, that the gold standard of which would be a randomized controlled trial, which is a scientific term for a genuine experiment where the control group is randomized, and this is outside of advertising, this is in all practices of science, or many practices of science, to create a control group under the exact same conditions that the test group is created, except for the difference of the stimulus that you're measuring for, in this case, advertising. But I think we'll talk about, we don't need to be purists and think that that's the only way to address incrementality, but that is the highest standard, and I'd kind of like to try to push the conversation in that direction. A colleague at Facebook in an email had this quote, and I thought it was really important to consider, which is that advertising is inherently a question of causality. The whole purpose of what we're trying to do is to persuade people to change their actions, probably first and foremost in terms of spending, and also their brand behaviors and maybe long-term customer loyalty, customer lifetime value. Let's remember, correlation is not causation. I mean, everybody's heard that approximately how many thousands of times, yet we forget that in advertising, where we measure predominantly the performance of the advertising with correlation-based techniques, multi-mix modeling, attribution, and these quasi-experiments where it's observational data that you're applying sophisticated analytics to. And there's a lot of value in that, but it is still correlation. And to measure causation, the best case way to do that would be experiments. And so there are a number of techniques that we'll probably get into in the conversation: randomized controlled trials, intent to treat, and a practice that I don't think I've heard much comment on so far at the event, ghost ads. I wonder how many of you are familiar with that. Ghost bids, predicted ghost ads. It's kind of a family of techniques that has really taken force in the last couple of years to make the practice of randomized controlled trials more pragmatic and effective in digital advertising at large scale, which has been adopted by companies like Google and Facebook and a number of ad tech companies. Just in kind of conclusion of my introduction, one anniversary, we've noted that this is the 1-year anniversary of GDPR. This year is also the 25-year anniversary of the banner ad. The banner ad was first created, you could argue, was it GDN, what was it? There was another network that claims that, and Prodigy even kind of claims they were there ahead of them. But I would go with Wired Magazine's website at the time was called Hot Wired, and they came out with some of the very first banners. In fact, prophetically, AT&T had one, the copy of which was echoing a campaign they had on TV, and it said, "Have you ever clicked your mouse right here? You will." And boy, they got that right. So it's 25 years we've been doing this, and the fact that the practice of randomized controlled trials, which has been hacked at by a few of us certainly on this stage, from the earliest years, but it's only really hitting, I believe, the tipping point today, 25 years later, because we had a lot of work to do. We had to build all the systems in the first place, and then we had to rebuild them all as programmatic, and we only answered the question of can the ad be viewed in terms of viewability a couple of years ago. And now there is a maturity among the marketers and among the technology to push these practices further in broader adoption. And so let me stop talking and invite some of our esteemed colleagues here to weigh in. So actually, Michael, you picked up the mic. I was going to ask you first. Could you help us understand what is really the distinction between randomized controlled trials and the emerging best practices of incrementality, and the subtle differences are subtle to a quick understanding of them anyway, in terms of the practices that are predominant in the market today?
Before I go into the depth there, I want to just make a comment on the notion of causality, which is obviously crucial. We spend in our marketing sciences practice an exorbitant amount of time trying to understand the causal diagram and the inferences, and trying to understand what is the consumer journey in the entire way, to then only allow the machine learning to correlate where we believe there is causation underlying, right? So that's an interesting part there. Back to the randomized test control cases, right? 20 years ago, I worked on behavior scan, which was a very interesting thing where you could splice in things into different markets, and we would match up these panelists on a test control basis to try and achieve symmetry based on their historical 1 year worth of weekly sales trends. And also making sure that all the other conditions are the same, but really trying to get to somewhat of what that gold standard is, of a clean, symmetric test design. And we had to also use analysis of covariance to level the playing field, to control for inevitable differences that are in the real world, always present. It's amazing how much we've made steps back actually with the digitalization, because so many metrics are out there, And I've seen countless presentations where folks come and it's like, oh, look, our ads drove 140% lift, 200% lift. And always the question is, oh, that's great. If that's true, why is the brand not growing? and I think a lot of that is like because people look at, here's my intent to treat, AKA I've spent a lot of good time trying to understand my high propensity target, right? Like who's most likely to convert. And I think you said that at the onset, and I'm sending them an ad message, and then I'm comparing that against folks that I did not expose. But I didn't even want to expose them, and obviously they have a much lower rate of conversion. So I'm thrilled to see that the predicted ghost ads are coming into a way of taking advantage of the programmatic algorithm in defining test and control groups, and I see that as over the years hopefully emerging as a practice that should be there every day. So you can go back to, I think the notion, right, Andy, you would say like, well, in CRM, like if you don't do a randomized test control setup, like what are you doing? So anyway.
That's great. Ken, in our lunch conversation yesterday, you had some choice words about MTA and a great anecdote about Britney Spears. I wonder if you could...
Yeah. Well, I mean,
and let me say, Ken was, one of those who was doing this at the very beginning and was a mentor to some of the folks who, I think they were interns even at the time at Yahoo, Randall Lewis and David Riley, who have gone on to, create ghost ads and some other very important techniques.
Yeah, I think, as we talked about and as you know, I became one of the first data analysts at Yahoo in the year 2000, not too long before we met, and I came from clinical trials before that. So I studied health sciences and drug development and spent about a decade trying to get drugs approved through the US FDA, which means deep understanding of randomized clinical trials, and joined Yahoo to try to bring the concept of experimentation to digital and also the concept of forecasting, because in the health world, we were trying to predict who's going to get influenza and things like this, and I thought maybe I can bring these kind of ideas to develop things like behavioral targeting and so forth. But anyway, to the point about MTA, there's these sort of odd examples that one can come up with. Like, for example, this isn't even a digital example, but imagine a car dealership, and there's someone standing in front of the car dealership handing out flyers saying, hey, come in, we have a Honda Accord for sale today, whatever. Now, if they may say, wow, 8% of the people who got this flyer ended up buying a car. It has an immense conversion rate, because the population average of number of people who buy a car in any given day is like 0.17% or something like that. So there's a huge lift. But again, there's no control group. Like, what if someone had not gotten that flyer? Would they have still bought a car that day? Typically walking down a street in front of a bunch of car dealerships? Probably yes. And the anecdote around Britney Spears that you talked about is some years ago, when I was working at Yahoo, because Yahoo had both search and display, we were interested in trying to use our own ecosystem to measure advertising effectiveness. So the idea was, what if we took people who are exposed to an ad and tried to see if they were more likely to then search for that particular item than those that weren't exposed to the ad? And the example I think I gave you the other day was a Honda Accord example, where we did a study and looked at people that are exposed to Honda Accord ads and just looked downstream to see, did they search more for Honda Accords? Well, guess what? We set up this experiment, or we thought it was, looking at Honda Accord placements that were in Yahoo Autos, they were in email, they were on Yahoo Sports, they ran run of network. We looked at all these exposures, and there was this massive lift in searches for Honda Accord. It was like 800%. And I was a little skeptical. I thought, this seems really high. Like, why is this so high? And started to look into it a bit more and thought, well, what if we looked at a different outcome? And so we looked at Britney Spears. And I was so skeptical that display advertising was driving search that I wanted to see, does display advertising, being exposed to a Honda Accord ad, make you more likely to search for Britney Spears? Guess what? That was about a 600% lift. In fact, every single search that I put in, there was somewhere between a 200 to 800% lift in searches. This is a type of bias known as activity bias. It's not that the ad was driving the searches, it's that a third factor, your activity on the web, was correlated with both. And we didn't understand it very well at the time. This was 2004. But I left Yahoo for 6 years, went through Dynamic Logic, Millward Brown, Kantar, came back to Yahoo 6 years later, and met my friends who were interns at the time, Randall Lewis and David Riley. They had, in the meantime, deeply understood this thing and published a paper called Here, There, and Everywhere. So you can search Randall Lewis, Here, There, and Everywhere, and read about a very fine paper that explains activity bias.
Great. Andy, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but let's get our advertiser on the panel, Markus from Sam's Club, into the conversation, one of our first clients at Central Control. This is a different way of thinking about marketing in a large extent. I mean, in my talking to a lot of people, just that first step is a doozy, to start thinking like a scientist and not take bad campaign results personally, and to engender that kind of culture of scientific exploration. And I just, I know that this has become a driving force with you and your team, and I want you just to expand a little bit about, the journey of how you guys got to this place and some of the key learnings you've made so far.
Sure. So first of all, short question. How many of you guys know Sam's Club? How many know Walmart? That's what I thought. So Sam's Club is the little sister company of Walmart. We still, pretty big in size. We generate $58 billion of revenue each year, and we have 600 stores, and we are a membership organization. So what it means is, I realized this week, I'm really like the spoiled kid in the room, right? I talked to a lot of people here at the conference about different challenges in analytics, but I have the pleasure of working with clean data. I know everyone who makes an online transaction, everyone who makes an offline transaction. So with that being said...
In fact, it's a membership club, so as soon as they walk through the door, they scan in.
Correct. When they walk out, actually, when they pay.
Oh, when they walk.
Yeah, opposite way. And our journey was quite interesting. So 2.5 years ago, we had a big change in leadership. A new VP of marketing, new VP of analytics, new VP of finance, new CEO. And what happened was we traditionally measured a lot of things, but we just measured for the sake of measurement without a clean framework. So some of our results were, I would say, misleading because there was not a proper measurement in place. Some of them were partly right. We did some marketing mix modeling, but results were not necessarily implemented. So our new leadership team is very, very data focused, which is great. So we still do marketing mix modeling once a year on a strategic level for strategic budget decisions. But what we've really implemented is this test and learn experimentation culture, right? So randomized control experiments wherever we can. In fact, we have a culture in place that if marketers want to spend a certain amount of dollars for whatever campaigns, they have to run an experiment in order to scale it. Which is really fun for us because we're getting engaged with marketers on all fronts for all different channels, Facebook, direct mail, email. And for some channels like direct mail, which we can control ourselves, we are really sophisticated also with, setting up experiments and measuring those. So we semi-automated the whole process. We developed a contact and response history over 2 years. We're building uplift models that help us to better target. So with the uplift models from the test and control results, we can target only those members who are very likely to respond to an ad, and skip those that are very unlikely to respond even though they receive an offer, and those lost causes that will not respond regardless of receiving an offer. So with direct mail channel, with email, what we're doing a similar approach right now, it looks really well that we're able to scale and do experimentation on a large scale. For digital, It's still quite a challenge for us, so we work with several partners, with LiveRamp, with Experian, with Axiom, and we have different technology partners where we set up test and controls, but in the digital world, if you set up a test and control, execute a campaign, you still need afterwards to balance for your test and control again, because the exposure files from the test group might now look very different than original control group. So we found mechanism at propensity modeling and kind of a bucketing synthetic control approach to account for that, but it's still very, very time consuming. So we are also big with partnering up with small and big companies like rig companies, Central Control, to find really new ways in order to scale and measure accurately, right? And I would actually recommend this to everyone, to try to partner up with different companies and see what works, what doesn't. I think also different companies solve for different problems. So we actually work already right now with several technology companies. For our ad business, for example, our online ad business, we use one provider. For our own campaign, we use another provider for several reasons. Even the McKinsey presentation that you saw, I think also, unified measurement and MTA can mean a lot of things. So I think it really depends on the objective that you have and what you want to measure, who you should partner up with. And lastly, I think for us, the next step in our experimentation journey is really to figure out how to measure things longitudinal and also with an MTA approach. So we have a new CMO in place, and we're starting to shift away from just promotional activities that usually have a window of, let's say, 14 days, and it's easy to set up a test and control and measure during that time. But what if you have a real brand building activity as a marketing vehicle, right? Awareness drive. Those have a way longer tail effect. I find it very challenging, marketing models, to account for the lag effects long term. Again, like as you saw in the McKinsey presentation, I think there's a lot of value in some of the providers that truly try to find a unified measurement approach and look at it longitudinal.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, so Andy, I know you're an original gangster in this industry and in this practice. And I'm interested especially to hear some of the stuff that you're doing in television, addressable television and otherwise, in this field of experimentation. But let me just throw out a broader question to get some of them, the ones that I jotted down into the conversation before we run out of time. What do you think, in your experience, also is going to help drive this adoption forward more and faster?
Okay, so a lot to cover. So the first thing I'll say is, and I'm going to be the cranky one here, I am shocked, literally shocked, that we are talking about incrementality. In every other channel, this has been the de facto way of looking at the universe since time began, right? All direct mail campaigns have formal test and controls associated with them. Propensity modeling, figuring out net present values, and then being able to understand what your incremental lift was is standard. All addressable TV campaigns that I've ever worked on have test and controls associated with them. All the traditional TV approaches, whether you're using things like the behavior scan marketplace and doing attribution against that. In the original behavior scan attribution models from the 1970s, there was a concept of test versus control, right? It was simulated, but it was there. And all the media mix models for television, you're trying to associate baseline and then lift over baseline. So to me, it's totally insane that the digital folks have just sort of never adopted this, right? And so, yeah, thank you. Come on, let's do that. And so I like to focus more on the reasons why digital hasn't adopted this, and helping to make sure that it does. And there's some silly reasons and there's some real reasons. Let's start off with the silly reasons. So the first silly reason is that we have this thing in digital called last touch attribution. And a lot of people don't know where last touch attribution came from or why it's last touch. And the reason why it's last touch, and I remember, because I was in the room when a lot of this stuff got decided, was that in the late 90s, if you look at the way that data flows into an ad server, you have event, 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 event. One of them is a conversion event. They're all keyed by cookie, right? They're also flowing in and being recorded on your disk by time, right? Because time is passing. And so when you actually need to do attribution, if you take what is a conversion event, right? Say someone buys something, and then you look back in time, the cheapest algorithm is last touch. That was the reason. It was, and when I say cheapest, I mean like dollars cheap. This was back in the day when a terabyte of data cost over $1 million to be for hosting, where this last touch attribution would, if you were an ad server, if you were someone like Flycast, just to pull out a name from the past, if you were someone like this would save you between $10 and $30 million if you just did the last touch. So it was just cheaper. It was an engineering design. It had nothing to do with reality. It was just, it was the cheapest thing that we could do. So that's what the industry did. So that's the first thing. Now that's not an issue anymore, but people still do it, right? People are ingrained into it. The second thing that happened is that in a lot of the digital medium, it's actually really hard to design a test. And so for the two that really jump out to me are affiliate and search, right? It's actually really tricky to do real testing control. There are ways, but it's tricky to do. And then in the digital side, like the digital display side of the business, with a test, what makes digital different than, say, direct mail or addressable TV is you have to pay for the control. And so no one wanted to pay for the control. And so, so a lot of the techniques that emerged were things like synthetic controls, you heard about that, which had the bias that you referred to. And now we're finally starting to see techniques like what Rick's describing with ghost ads, where effectively you can construct a control without having to pay for it. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to dollars and cents. And so, you know, in my opinion, it's time for digital to, and I know this is going to get me in trouble, it's time for digital to catch up to the rest of the advertising and marketing industry, right? And start embracing these techniques, because now they are low cost enough, they're good enough, and there's no excuse. So, sorry. No. So
yeah, if I may. You know, I wonder also the same thing, like, why hasn't it been, it's not without effort, right? I mean, is anybody in the room old enough to remember something called Yahoo Consumer Direct? It was a technology developed in 2001. It was launched in 2002, which was, I believe, the first closed-loop targeting and measurement system for measuring lift in CPG sales. And
I'm going to give a shout out to Leslie Wood there, the Chief Research Officer of NCS.
right, it was a fantastic idea, was developed, and you know, it was a long time ago, and it did happen, and the very first version of it actually used randomized controls, and it caused Yahoo's consumer packaged goods revenue to increase from $5 million in that time to about $250 million. Yes, $250 million in CPG revenue. So it's not a non-trivial thing, but it is interesting that many, many others did not adopt it. And one of the reasons I think it is because maybe people didn't really want to know the truth at the end of the day. Like, if you think about Last Touch, I mean, I can even have a more cynical idea of how that was developed. It really helped Google a lot, right? I mean, if you think about, suppose you want to buy an iPad. You're too lazy to go to apple.com/iPad, right? So you go to Google and you type iPad, you probably click on the paid search link and you end up somewhere. Is Google going to get a $325 credit attributed to the fact? Well, I've used Google totally navigationally in that situation. I happen to click on the paid link instead of the natural link, which, by the way, is right below it. And so, you know, maybe there's some conspiracy as well, but Last Touch really benefited search. It benefited search absolutely immensely. And, you know, sometimes ads are not super effective. And I wonder if part of the reason why people haven't accepted randomized clinical trials is because they're a little bit afraid. And there was a speaker earlier that talked about, well, when we do advertising effectiveness, we need to kind of let go of the idea that it's used to just prove something worked or not. We need to really use it to understand how things work and slice the data by various factors to see what works best. Whenever you do a true experiment, there's always something that works best. There's always a learning opportunity. So if people can let go of the fact that it's really about did this work or not, and instead go to more of an insights. I think that might be, to answer your original question, like how do we get more adoption, is to move away from the accountability concept of ad effectiveness and more toward an insights concept of ad effectiveness.
That's great. I'll take this one question because it's very self-serving. How do you run randomized control trials outside of a single walled garden or a single DSP? Most campaigns buy ads on different sources where users don't share a single ID, causing leakage of exposures. That's true. Like now in market, really in the last 2 or 3 years, there are Google, Facebook, as well as MediaMath, Xandr, AdRoll, and some others have developed mechanisms like the ghost ads technique that we're talking about, but they can measure that only in the footprint of their own media environment. That is why our company is called Central Control, not because we're a creepy big brother. That was just the irony in the name, but it's because we are the centralized control. I'm really not aware of anybody doing something like this, but the basic technique is that we ally ourselves with multiple of these ad systems and do integrations and then control with one user ID space across the multiple media properties the experiment conditions. I don't know if there's anything anybody else wants to add on that point.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's on a unified data layer is the starting point, right? As you said, resolving identity at the center. But today, we still have to stitch together many different micro-digital outcome measurements, right? From here, okay, I can get this out of the Facebook native platform, I can get this out of DBM, I can get, and so forth. And then we solve for it in our application layer, where we can then stitch it together into an optimization that's holistic. Because in the end, what we really are trying to do is make our clients' dollars work harder, right? Like, ultimately. And then it gets to the action. And I think part of the lack of adoption is also, it seems also complicated, right? Those are not, like, there's the scientific concepts, and as much as I think science has kind of marched into the advertising industry, it's still somewhat foreign as well.
Yeah, I've heard, it described as fear of finding out, by entities in the mix that may be threatened by the results that come forward with this. I've also heard it described as fear of thinking too hard. To that point, what is the disruptive nature, if any of you want to take that question, of this kind of approach to the status quo? And let me throw in there, my perspective is this doesn't break any of the existing mechanisms for measuring ROI. It provides a missing truth set to calibrate MTA and mixed model and even more quasi-experimental approaches against, by feeding in data from, more of a clean test and control. But is that, part of do you think there's actually maybe resistance to this, or is this threatening to anybody, or is this frightening to anybody?
I think it's really just like a, change management culture also inside of organization. I mean, it's a fact that until today, digital measurement takes time, right? Like you need to work with third parties, you need to exchange large data sets. It takes a while, it's not scalable. So if you have a solution like last click and touch and place, and you just, as a marketer, operate that way, I think it's really just within companies also changing the culture, right? Like to really start adapting to it. And results will look different, right? That's the other piece, right? Like last click, you only have online conversions. If you're omni-channel player, you all of a sudden add the offline channels to it. Results will start looking different.
So if I may, more crankiness. So I work with a lot of Fiserv companies. And so for the ones, and all these Fiserv companies are doing a lot of CRM work, and their culture has just been built around CRM. And it is, that culture has been in place, and there's no problem with let's learn and test and design and improve and improve. The thing where it gets a little bit weird with digital is when you start doing these digital techniques what will happen is the economics of running a campaign will change, because it will become more expensive to run the campaign. You'll need a different type of people. You'll need to optimize it more. You'll need to buy data. So that can be a real challenge for advertisers and agencies, as they realize they actually have to invest to actually make this work. And I think that's the unspoken reason why a lot of this stuff doesn't happen.
Yeah, and the skill sets are something, I heard in another discussion I was part of, to hire people trained as economists, who come out of a culture of that kind of experimental design.
Which is why it all comes back down to the money in the end.
Exactly.
Because those people cost more. That simple.
Well, that's a great note to close on. I don't know how long our time has been up, but our time is up. So thank you very much, and enjoy lunch.
Well, thank you. That was a classic panel. I think we need a recording of that. It felt to me a bit like a meeting of Attribution Practitioners Anonymous. But we're about ready to break for lunch here, so head back here at about 2:40, if you can. And follow the money.